Physical abuse is what we know as domestic battery. A battery by domestic violence under the law involves hitting, smacking, punching, kicking, strangling, pointing a firearm at, threatening with a knife, engaging in behavior that actually touches the other person, all the way down to throwing something that ends up hitting someone. That's also considered a battery, and those are all domestic violence under the law for purposes of custody and divorce matters. Emotional abuse or mental abuse is not looked at as domestic violence under the law. However, it will be considered in some ways by the court. Depending on the severity of the abuse, you can show the judge why the child's best interests are served being with the non-abusive parent, so the child doesn't pick up those behaviors. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that you have that great relationship with your kid that you deserve to have. While emotional abuse can be just as damaging as physical abuse, it's not considered domestic violence under the law. The law punishes criminal acts of battery, sexual abuse as domestic violence. They don't classify any emotional or mental abuse as domestic violence. The way that comes up in a custody case is the fitness of the parents. So if one parent is abusive mentally and emotionally, it will still come up in court, but it'll come up as the ability of that parent to provide for the needs of that child and the fitness of that parent to raise the child. It doesn't come up as domestic violence that would lead to a presumption that the person is unfit. Another type of abuse that's not mentioned frequently is financial abuse. Financial abuse is not domestic violence under the law either. Financial abuse would be when one person withholds money or doesn't allow the other person access to money or the lifestyle that the other spouse is living. I've seen this in cases where one spouse owns the home and treats the other spouse like a guest in the home. Doesn't let them make any decisions about the house, basically doesn't let it feel like home, and then also controls all of the finances. So the second spouse has to ask permission to use money, has to ask permission to buy something or to go somewhere or to do anything and get approval from the other spouse and get the money from that person. They gatekeep to the money. It's different if you're making a joint decision to do or not do something, but when one person is asking for access to the money and is denied, that's when it might be financial abuse. This is also not really taken into consideration in a divorce in Nevada. However, it can lead to an unequal division of the community property to try and make up for some of those financial problems that the spouse who was the guest in that house might have suffered because of that financial control. It's always important to be aware of the finances in your marriage, not just because the other spouse could be abusive, but because you wouldn't know if they're being abusive. You wouldn't know what's going on if you don't have that information. Information and knowledge is so powerful. If you have questions about what's going on, give us a call and we're happy to go over that with you. Abusive behavior follows a cycle. There's an outburst of abusive behavior, and then there's usually a honeymoon phase, which is where they're apologizing, they feel bad, they're buying you flowers, they're trying to win you back, they're showing you how sorry they really are. That lasts for a little while, and then you get into a tension building phase. The tension builds and builds and builds and builds until there's another outburst. The outburst may be violent, it may just be a screaming match. It could come up as any way, but it's basically something that leaves you feeling hurt. It leaves you feeling maybe scared. Maybe you feel like that person doesn't value you. Part of that is because they're using that to punish you for the things that you're doing they disagree with. So when you're looking to see, is this going to get worse? Look at that cycle. The last time that something happened where they got angry, was it the same as it happened this most recent time? Was it different? Did they get angrier? Did they touch you or just yell at you? Look at all of the things to see if they're escalating. Even if it's not escalating though, do you really want to be in a position where you're worried about your safety when you make them mad? And that's when it might be time to consider having a safety plan where you can exit that relationship and you have a plan in place to get out before it gets to a more violent point. I recommend a book to everyone I talk to. It's called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men by Dr. Lundy Bancroft. And it's a book that's written from an abuser's perspective on why they're doing what they're doing. It might give you some insight on what's going on and help you understand how better to protect yourself. No matter how it's showing up in your relationship, abusive conduct is always damaging. If you are worried about whether or not you're being abused, whether or not you need resources, and what your next step should be, give us a call and we'll help you get through that.